Brainiacs, welcome. Hey, it's Dwight, here again with you to blow our minds and break our brains around something truly awesome. This is a very interesting clinical show based off of some exciting research and techniques that are being done in the area of computer-assisted therapy. You know computers, right? You've heard of them, this new fad, this new trend. You might have one in your hand right now as you're hitting the fast forward button to get past my intro. It's a phone, really, but it does a lot of things. That's what we're talking about. Dr. Jesse Wright is kind enough to join me today to talk a little bit more about that. So you'll hear the audio, of course, of this interview here. If you ever want to see the video version of the interviews that we have, those get uploaded onto our Patreon, along with all our bonus materials, brokenbrain.com. That's not true. Patreon.com/brokenbrain. If you want to take part in those things, support the show, and see the bonus materials. We're actually dropping a new episode in a couple days here of The Broken Chat, which is the Patreon show with myself and Chris Revel, host of the Let's Chat podcast as well. Something else exciting that's going to be coming up is that Dr. Wright is also an author whose first novel is coming out soon, and he's agreed outside the confines of the recording, he's agreed to come on and talk a little bit about the creative process and also some other issues that touch on PTSD and pharmacological research as well. So he's got a lot to share with us, and I would really like to make his book the first book that we're going to include in our Broken Brain book club. So for those of you that would like to get involved with that, please hit me up or message me on Twitter or email me. And you hear me give those details all the time at BreakABrain on Twitter, DwightHurst@gmail.com. And I think we got an Instagram brewing that we'll try to be setting up soon. I'd like to start that up soon to be able to have a book club for us to enjoy that together. So that's something we'll get going now. But for today, let's get on topic now with computer-assisted therapy. When I went to graduate school, we talked about this crazy idea of online therapy, and now look at, especially in the last few years, how much we're using, Zoom or other applications that have been developed to even just have a meeting like we're having right now, except that's your therapy session, right? And so things have changed so much, and I'm really excited to get into discussing this. But before we get into the computer-assisted CBT stuff, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who you are and how did you get into this corner of this field?
Well, thanks so much, Dwight, for inviting me to be with you today and with your audience. I'm a professor at the University of Louisville, where I'm also director of the Depression Center, which is one of, I think, 24 or 25 depression centers around the United States that are in major universities. And so I do a lot of work with people with depression, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, OCD, PTSD, and have been in this space of delivering care and teaching it and writing about it for several decades now. And I started in on the idea of using technology to increase access to effective therapies and to make it easier for people to do it and easier for therapists to do it pretty early on. In fact, our very first effort on this was in the mid-'90s. So I'm, I guess, sort of ancient mariner here, if you will, of technology and the use in psychotherapy. I remember the very first time I gave a talk on this. Since I'm a professor, I get invited to do so-called grand rounds or other kinds of presentations at universities and around the United States and the world. The very first one I gave, there was just huge skepticism, and I was treated like some kind of ingrate or a radical, which I've never fashioned myself as being such a person. By the way, I must say, I never believed that technology would replace the wisdom, kindness, empathy, creativity, all those good things that therapists either just have the native ability to do that or actually, and then learn how to do that through many years of going to school and practicing.
That's the thing.
My whole idea has been to use technology to help everybody out.
It's so funny that you see that wrinkle come up in so many different things. Whenever we talk about technology, everybody wants to talk about either, oh, it's going to replace us, or Skynet, Terminator kind of stuff, or whatever, the doom and gloom thing people think about technology, when actually the only thing we've ever really used technology for is to do whatever we're doing kind of enhanced, or do it in a different or better way without changing. Yeah, exactly. So it is funny. I don't know if you found this. I have found that I think it's aging out a little bit here with younger people, whatever, coming in, I guess. But traditionally, therapists of my professional generation, pretty Luddite. I mean, I've always been surprised how many were just like, I don't even know how to use these computerized notes. And I've seen people lose their jobs because they wouldn't adapt to online medical records to actually just enter notes, right? So it's a population of people who are a little slow for technology sometimes.
Yeah, I think therapists tend to be sort of stuck in their ways, in my opinion. The whole idea that the only way to do therapy is in the 50-minute hour, or in essentially an hour sitting down with a patient in an office. There were huge numbers of holdouts that didn't really want to see it any other way until just recently with the COVID pandemic. I think people have looked at that in a different way, particularly with delivering therapy via Zoom or other kind of online safe platforms for communicating with patients. I know my patients, most of them don't want to go back to coming into the office because it takes so much time, and they have to pay for parking and so forth.
Absolutely. I've seen that too. Yeah, I've seen that too, where some people are just the convenience of it's easier to take a lunch hour than it is to take 3 hours out of the middle of the day to go in for therapy or whatever. Yeah, if you have to drive any significant distance. Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of those things were amplified. Really, the pandemic was very interesting to see how it amplified some of the use of technology that probably in many corners of our society we probably should have been doing anyway, making available to people anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
Of course, there have been barriers to use of technology. Insurance companies not wanting to pay for service unless it's delivered face-to-face, state licensure laws that get in the way of you seeing somebody. For example, I'm in Kentucky, in Louisville, and right across the river is Indiana. And if you're in Indiana, you're an Indiana resident, you have to come into my office. So we can't do it by telemedicine any longer.
Wow.
So they're sort of antiquated barriers and rules and laws and malpractice situations and questions that need to be resolved for us to use technology to its fullest potential, try to help people with access to the care they need.
What kinds of things were you expressing and telling in these early trainings that you say when people were like, "What's a computer?" No, maybe they weren't that bad, but in the 90s, there probably were people working in the 90s who were like that. But what kinds of things were you advocating then, and how did people take it?
Yeah, just a little bit of history first, Dwight.
Sure.
The very beginnings of using a computer to talk with another human being in a therapeutic way go back to the 60s, believe it or not. So we're looking at over 50 years plus. And there was a very early program called ELIZA. Some of you that are listening in may have heard of this. It is ancient history, but it's very interesting history. It was developed, I think, at MIT, and it tried to simulate the kind of so-called non-directive or supportive therapy that Carl Rogers, a famous early leader in psychotherapy, proposed. And so you'd see a little text message like, "How are you feeling today?" And the person would type in depressed, and the computer would come back in with, "You say you're depressed. Why are you depressed?" or something like that. And for the first couple of questions, it worked pretty well. But after that, it went into all kinds of blind alleys and crazy kind of alleys that actually frustrated the people that used it. So that was the very earliest attempt. And then in the 80s, there were a few very early programs that were text only, back in the days when we had Commodore 64s, the very earliest Apples and so forth. And I'm old enough to know what that world was like and to have been around when the first computers came out. And I saw some of those early programs and thought, gee, my patients that are depressed, there's no way they're going to sit down in front of a screen and do this kind of a thing.
So it's kind of the cultural thought process too, right? I think of some of the early representations. You think of like, I don't know, take a movie like Desk Set or something like that, where it's this early, here's this thing, it's amazing, but boy, it's not going to work ultimately. There's this expectation of, once again, it's either the Terminator that's going to take over the world, the Matrix or whatever, or it's just this goofy thing that's just going to say, how are you feeling? That's all I got,
Right. So you asked what kind of responses I got, say, in the mid-'90s when I started with the very earliest prototypes with using video and audio, multimedia, trying to make these things much more engaging and easier for people to get into and relate to. The skepticism came out of that kind of experience of thinking about what computers were like and what they could do to some extent. But it was also at a time of still huge influence of psychoanalytically oriented therapy. And the idea of how therapy would work was different perhaps than it is now, with therapies like cognitive behavior therapy, cognitive processing therapy, other behavior therapies, even interpersonal therapy or acceptance commitment therapy are more practical. We try to help people learn new things, to gain skills, to pick up ideas that they can use to try to solve some problems in their life or to think and act in different ways. So it's the therapy process, and what you're trying to get people to get them to the point of being able to do may be different than a psychoanalyst who was spewing this thing primarily through transference and defense mechanisms and very early childhood experiences, and saw therapy as something that was several times a week, intensive dream analysis and free association and so forth and so on. So one of the first comments I got was that, Dr. Wright, do you realize what kind of a narcissistic wound you are inflicting on these patients when you ask them to use a computer as part of therapy? Wow. And I was taken aback because I would never want to narcissistically wound one of my patients.
That's fighting words a little bit there. Yeah.
I go back to the addictive do no harm. I wanted to help. And I sort of wonder, well, gee, am I narcissistically wounding my patients? That no, this couldn't be. I think that maybe the psychoanalyst was narcissistically wounded.
Or trying to wound you. That's a very specific accusation.
Exactly. Wound my narcissism. Whatever was left of it by the time I just sort of slinked out of that grand rounds.
How is that not a term that people are throwing around on Twitter at each other? Narcissistic. You've narcissistically wounded me. I can't imagine.
I don't know. I'm glad that's
media.
gone, to tell you the truth.
Yeah. Oh, but yeah, I'm just, as I'm picturing that, as you're saying that, I remember giving a presentation once at a conference where you have that dynamic where there's the one person that's stone-faced and you think, well, that person hates me. And then for the rest of the time thinking, why do they hate me? What's going, so that's me. I'm projecting myself now into this where that person speaks up and says, you're narcissistically wounding people. I think I'd probably maybe I just leave and never go out in public again. Maybe not quite that, but that's pretty hard pushback you're running into there.
Well, fortunately, by then, I started to work with Aaron Beck in 1979, very early in the history of cognitive behavior therapy. He was a wonderful mentor to me. By the way, he just died just a couple months ago at age 100. Really a phenomenal person and a phenomenal contribution to wellness and to mental health.
And I'll say,
so I was able. I knew enough cognitive therapy to take a look at that and not catastrophize about the fact that I was this terrible psychiatrist that was inflicting wounds on people.
That's good.
So I guess I've kept going at this. I've done research now ever since then and continue to do it. So I didn't give up.
Do you find it motivating to be able to bring sometimes there's a certain motivation in being able to bring out things that people are denying if it is helpful. You know what I mean? I mean, think of the first time somebody said, wash your hands in between surgery. You know, I mean, they're thankfully that person or whoever, that group of people, were motivated, right, by the resistance to say, no, this is going to help people. And so I wonder, did you find a motivation to push ahead, or did you find that some people started to embrace at some point?
Well, the answer is both, I think, because I was not daunted by those kinds of comments. And there's been huge resistance, by the way, to using computer-assisted therapy. Resistance is fading some now, but they're still out there. I think I got encouragement along the way because there are people that saw the value in this very early on. People like Aaron Beck, my good friend Michael Thace at the University of Pittsburgh, who I've done research with, saw this very early. John Rush, who's a leading psychiatrist, championed this, helped me write my first grant. Invited me down to Texas, where he was at the time, and we spent about a week just brainstorming, thinking about how to get some research funding to begin to do this stuff. And so there have been many people along the way that have said this is a good idea and have encouraged it. And interestingly, the National Institute of Mental Health has been very supportive, has believed early in the potential value of digital delivery of components of therapy, and still are supporting this. So they've been great.
That's good. I mean, it's good to see. And I feel like there you got both, like the idealistic side, which is like, oh, there's something magical about us sitting in a room together. And I'll say, not that there isn't. I've had the experience of having seen people only through Zoom during the pandemic and then having people come in. The really interesting thing is there often is something about being face to face that seems to be more effective, but I've noticed that only seems to exist. And I might be a weird because I do things for years I've done some online sessions. I've done podcasting like this for a long time where I've gotten used. I have people that are some of my best friends who I've only talked to through this kind of media format, right? And so for me, I don't really have a huge difference. For me, I feel like I'm talking to someone either way, over online or in person. But for the people who get something out of it, they get something out of it. But if they don't, they absolutely don't. In other words, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's very subjective by the person. It's not objective of, oh, well, this is lesser than. Online is somehow lesser than objectively. And I realize we're not only talking about online therapy today. I'm just using that as an example.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that observation. It's just one size doesn't fit all. There are individual differences, and as therapists, we need to be quite aware of that and try to customize what we do to meet their needs. So I'm doing most of my sessions now by Zoom, but I do go into the office. I was just in the office yesterday and saw a number of people that some of them are from Indiana because they can't see me by Zoom. So they came across the room.
You said that. That's such an interesting rule. Yeah.
Yeah. Others prefer to see me in person. And so I think what we're going to see now is that as one of my friends said, the genie's out of the bottle as far as delivery of therapy online and by Zoom or whatever other platform you're using. And we're probably not going to be able to put it back in there completely and have a time when all of our treatment is face-to-face in the office.
Well, they have services now. I mean, for those that listen to podcasts and that they advertise like BetterHelp, and not to buzz market any particular companies. I don't know how they do. I just hear their ads on other things. But, that they cater to the needs of saying like, it's a little bit of a lower cost. They have shorter sessions available. They also even have text chains back and forth that you don't have to do all in one sitting with your therapist if that's what you prefer. And the idea of actually designing things that meet the needs of an individual is something I think really all of us should get behind, is individualism of treatment. The more that we do that, the more we seem to notice that it works better to individualize treatment. So it's very interesting to see some of those changes.
Yeah, just take the amount of time for a session or how frequent sessions could be. I have some patients that really prefer a longer session and get a lot out of it, and we do some of those. But I have a lot of patients that really like shorter sessions, mm-hmm. that prefer that and do quite well with it and do a lot of the work of therapy, of picking up skills and practicing them and so forth between sessions, using things like computer-assisted therapy, even old-fashioned workbooks, mm-hmm. which are still pretty good.
Yeah,
and I recommend them to many people. Yeah, there was a bit of research though that I wanted to
yes,
tell you
please.
about that relates to this issue of, is face-to-face better than some kind of video connection to a patient or using a computer program or whatever. We did do a meta-analysis. I'm not sure all your readers are familiar with that term. But what that means is we looked at all the available controlled studies on a particular question and did a statistical analysis of those to try to figure out what the overall findings were. And we were looking at the effectiveness of computer-assisted therapy for depression. And we found 40 studies across the world that they were pretty stringent criteria for high-class studies that were done very well. And one of the questions we asked was there any difference in the effectiveness depending upon how support was rendered? In other words, was the people used a computer program, but most of them also got some contact with a clinician. It wasn't like just the computer's your treatment. I call it a hybrid model where there's human interaction plus a computer part, and you're trying to increase the efficiency and access to therapy. So anyway, what we found out was that face-to-face and telephone, this is, by the way, before telemedicine with video was widely available. Most of these studies were done several years ago. There was no difference between telephone versus face-to-face, interestingly. But then when you went down to look at email or text versus telephone or face-to-face, they were not as effective.
Interesting.
So the take-home message I'd have, this needs to be looked at again and replicated with more studies. But my message was that there's something about hearing the human voice or seeing the person that makes a difference. Yeah. That's better than some kind of text message that may or might not even be done at the time you're connecting with a patient. Yeah. It could be done 5 or 10 or a couple days later. That's called asynchronous. Yeah. Meaning you're not right there with the patient. I think there's something about being there. Mm-hmm. Even as we're talking now, I can see you. We have a video link, even though I think this is going out on audio, so I can see your facial expressions, and that helps me gauge whether what I'm saying is something useful or not.
Yeah,
and that's very helpful. Yeah,
it is interesting. And even as I was thinking about the vocal piece that you're saying, I've had a few people where it kind of generally morphed into this, and it's only a handful, but a few people that I've worked with who have opted into phone or turned off their camera, and they'll put on some headphones, and especially for some people who might have like an ADHD type of issues or things like that, actually just hearing their voice, just putting the phone down, putting their headphones in, and walking around or puttering around the house during the session actually allows them to pay more attention in some ways and get more out of the session, which is interesting.
Yeah, there are so many different ways of learning, and if that works for the person, I'd say do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting. When you get into the idea of computer assisted, why don't we maybe say a few things about what does that mean? We've touched on this idea of like online. Obviously, everybody knows what that is now with different platforms. But when we say computer assisted therapy, what are we talking about? What are some flavors of that?
Yeah, let's just do some definitions so we're sure we're talking about the same thing. Computer assisted therapy, or sometimes it's called CCBT, meaning computer assisted cognitive behavior therapy. Sometimes it's called ICBT for internet connected CBT. Typically means that you're asking the patient to spend some of their therapy effort working with a computer program that's been designed to help them learn about some basics of a particular therapy approach and then apply that in everyday life, in addition to some kind of contact with a clinician, which is typically quite abbreviated compared to standard therapy. Let me just give you an example. We just published a study in JAMA Network Open on using computer-assisted cognitive behavior therapy with a program that I helped develop. It's called Good Days Ahead. And that program has 9 lessons that take a person, 15 or 20 minutes to do. They're not super demanding. Anyone can do them, even people that are pretty depressed, and even people that haven't had much or any computer experience can learn how to use it. So it's gauged to be very user-friendly and very engaging. It's very video-rich. In fact, when people use the program, they have a guide or a therapist who they can choose who helps them through the program. And in this particular program, Good Days Ahead, they can either pick me, so they get an older guy with some white hair, or they can pick a young female psychiatrist from the University of Pennsylvania. And I haven't looked recently about what the frequency is. I guess maybe I'd have a narcissistic balloon if I found that they were choosing more
picking her
of a younger
you.
woman than they are of me. But it gives you an example of customization of what kind of a therapist, if you would. So you see videos, and we help people get the basic idea of CBT or cognitive behavior therapy. They see some videos of a person who's going through depression and anxiety in various areas of her life, and then she begins to use CBT, and the person that's using the program, or the patient, if you will, is picking up that knowledge and then applies it in areas of their own life, gets lots of feedback, lots of interactive exercises, and the clinician has a clinician dashboard and can look in and see how far the patient's gone with the program, whether they're comprehending it, what kind of mood ratings they have, and can even look at the exercises they do. For example, if you're knowledgeable about cognitive behavior therapy, one thing we try to do is write down some of their thoughts in a thing called a thought change record. And then we use that log to try to modify thoughts that are getting people more depressed or more anxious. And so the therapist can take a look at that. So anyway, just try to boil this down. So there are these 9 lessons, and typically the therapist would spend maybe 20 minutes once a week for 8 to 12 weeks, guiding the patient and customizing what they're getting out of the program, and also helping them troubleshoot particular areas in their own life. So in this study I mentioned, the total amount of therapist time was about 2.5 hours compared to typical cognitive behavior therapy, which would be 16 to 20 hours. In other studies we've done, we've seen reduction in therapist contact time of 2/3 or more. And if we look across the world at many studies, there have been studies done where the therapist contact is down to 2 hours, somewhat less, or sometimes a little bit longer, but it's usually not 16 or 20 hours.
Yeah.
In an earlier study we did, which was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry a couple of years back, we did this with the University of Pennsylvania and University of Pittsburgh and University of Louisville. We compared computer-assisted therapy with standard cognitive behavior therapy in patients with major depression. They were drug-free. And we found that the therapies were equal. Both of them worked great, even though we cut down the therapist contact time dramatically in computer-assisted therapy. So the take-home message from it, and by the way, patients give it great ratings and like it. Not everyone likes it. Some people would rather do the old-fashioned way, but some people like it better.
Well,
I've had patients that say, I don't want to talk anymore to that therapist. I prefer just to use the computer program. And have others that say they want more of the therapy time, but that's the way it goes. And the take-home message would be that you can make therapy more efficient, more wide available, more convenient for the patient, because a lot of it is done on their own time. You don't have to schedule with the patient. And it empowers them, and it saves a bunch of money.
One of the things that's actually one of the first things that hits me too when you talk about efficiency. The first 2 things that hit me are access to care and cost of care, or those are 2 big issues for people today, right, nowadays. And to say,
very much so, particularly with COVID. I think you probably heard about some of the statistics, but they're dramatic. Their increases 20, 30% anyway of rates of depression and anxiety, and lots of clinics flooded with referrals.
And a lot of related and connected issues with mental health in general. I mean, we saw the record number of overdose deaths of opioids and overdose, drug abuse this last year. I mean, when I say the record, it's the record ever that's ever been recorded in the U.S., right? And so you've got that, along with increases of domestic violence, increases of other kinds of things that are either directly or tangentially connected with mental health. And so you see a lot of those things. The other thing, too, that people don't think about when we talk about this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not hearing anybody being a proponent of saying this is now therapy. This is now the only therapy. Let's get rid of all other therapy. These things aren't even actually mutually exclusive if you have access to care. I mean, one example that I run into a lot is EMDR, right? People use that a lot nowadays for trauma processing. I've actually done therapy with people where we were doing kind of just more traditional sort of like talk therapy and insight-based therapy. And I found out that, oh yeah, my EMDR therapist, blah, blah, blah. And usually someone would only do one or the other. But if they have access to something, they can do both. The EMDR therapist didn't kick them out because they found out they were talking to me. And I didn't, neither one of us is, I mean, it's not good business to kick people out for having other things in their life anyway. But anyway, you can use the traditional approach, and this would be great to accentuate it if that's what you want, or if you find that this is helpful and not that, or that is helpful and not this. I mean, that. I think putting tools in a toolbox, kind of a metaphor, is useful for people to remember that's what we're talking about.
I like that a lot, Dwight. In fact, I think I'll coin that phrase of increasing the tools in your toolbox. Another angle here I thought I should mention. I just saw a article just very recently. This was online about burnout rates in therapists. And it turns out that with COVID, burnout rates are higher. It was in the high 50% of psychologists and psychiatrists were saying that they were burned out. Yeah. That's a pretty frightening number. And I wonder if using technology could possibly help therapists have less burnout. Now, let me explain why. I'll give you one quick example.
Yeah.
If you do cognitive behavior therapy, a lot of it is helping patients understand some of the basic principles, essentially teaching them about what automatic thoughts are, which are these thoughts that just run through our heads that are self-condemning or cause anxiety or inner tension or whatever, and then how to work with those, how to log them, how to look for rational thoughts, how to spot cognitive errors, how to use behavioral activation, things like that. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out that if you use a computer tool, the computer does a bunch of that for the therapist. The therapist can say, here's this thing, I want you to work on this to pick up this idea, and then we're going to talk more about that in the next session and how it can be useful in your own life. And so the therapist is freed up to use more of their creative skills and wisdom and whatever they think might be particularly helpful for the patient, instead of going with the same thing each time.
That's one of the things, especially for those of us that are a little more process-based in our minds, or maybe some of us a little more ADHD like myself, to where use of the session time, there's that component too in session where sometimes you might go over something that's really, really useful, where it's like, how did it go and what's your thought checking and journaling, and we talk about all this. And occasionally both the therapist and the patient feel a little bit like, we haven't really talked about things in a while. And it's like, yeah, we were doing therapy, but where's I kind of want to talk about this thing that happened yesterday therapy. And you're saying how in a model that can lend itself to fall into a little bit of being didactic, here's a way for there to be a little process-based discussion that's in there too.
Absolutely. I remember one of Aaron Beck's, one of his comments that really caught my attention early on was that emotion is the royal road to cognition. Meaning if you wanted to pick up the thoughts that were really important to people, look for high degrees of emotion. In a session, if there's a lot of tension or sudden crying or anger or whatever, that's the time to look up, okay, what have you been thinking about? And so we want to, in our sessions with patients, we want to have a lot of emotion and be able to get that out there and feel together and use that to try to enhance our understanding and move ahead. And I think that you can do more of that, perhaps, if you have some of the structure of therapy, some of the teaching therapy that's done by this tool that you can bring out and say, hey, do this, and then we'll be able to spend some time real productively in our sessions.
And that's, and in a way, that sort of addresses one of the common critiques people have of cognitive behavioral therapy, is that, especially if you have a therapist who went right from their training program to their internship to their profession, working I used to work at a community mental health agency, and it was very much Medicaid reporting requirements were all like a bunch of like self-measured scales every session of 1 to 10. How did you do on this week? Well, you did a 5. Why not a 4? And why not a 6? And good for you, but where could we improve? And you could spend more than one session checking in on like 2 or 3 goals. And the complaint people have about that is that sometimes it gets a little bit like just sort of feeling case managery, like, okay, I'm going in and ticking off boxes. And so actually, in a way, by using a computer to do the ticking off boxes component of that style of therapy, you can actually talk to each other like human people. So that's
I like that.
A little bit more.
In defense of the computer part, I would like to say, Dwight, that those of us that have designed these programs have tried to design them so that they stir up a lot of emotion also. It's not just a checkbox kind of a thing. In fact, I've had many patients who, when they see a video of someone, like in our particular program, Good Days Ahead, we try to make the people like every woman or every man. They're very common kinds of situations that they get into. It's like a light bulb goes off. Yeah. There's this huge emotion. Gee, this is me. This is the way I've always been trapped in this way of seeing myself, the way I put myself down all the time. And it's life transforming to be able to see it that way. So what we see with computer assisted therapy that adds to what a therapist does is a lot of very engaging and exciting learning opportunities that a therapist may not be able to construct in a therapy session.
Well, even just the limit of time.
Video might be worth even more.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's a real fascinating component, is the design feature when you are putting in those emotional, I don't want to say triggers because that's got a whole meaning, but those emotional checkpoints and things that will pull out an emotional response for people. How do you approach that? What kind of considerations do you put in there? It sounded like representation is one of them. People want to feel like they identify with the people they're seeing.
Sure. Identifying with people, having a guide or a therapist who's setting it up so that we're interested in you and interested in your feelings and your thoughts and you as a person, and giving feedback with text and with audio that helps people feel like they're engaged with the program. The last thing we want is just to be some kind of dry academic exercise. In fact, one of the myths about CBT or cognitive behavior therapy is that's what it is. It's very manual based or didactic. And yes, there is a certain amount of psychoeducation and learning involved. If the therapy's done well, it's very emotionally relevant and emotionally relevant. Yeah.
No, and that's one thing, when I hear people pick on CBT, that's I always like to bring people on who do lots of different disciplines in mental health on the show. But when I hear people say, oh, CBT, that's exactly the thing they say. And it is interesting. It reminds me, in a way, it's connected in a way to when you see, if anybody's ever watched old videos, and you can find these on YouTube, old training videos of like Carl Rogers doing therapy. Now, Rogerian therapy, which, as you put it with, was it Eliza? They tried to have Eliza do in the 60s, right? A Rogerian therapy, which is, it's kind of where all the jokes come from, the jokes that you might see on movies and TV where a therapist just sits there and says, tell me how you feel about that. It's reflective, unconditional self-regard or positive regard. How did you feel about that? Tell me more about your feelings. I'm just here to listen, like those Rogerian principles. And I think people like that has a stereotype, right, of just the therapist sitting there passively. But if you go back and watch like Carl Rogers demonstrating his modes of therapy, he wasn't very passive when he was talking to people. He was very engaged. And if you think about having an active listener who gives you unconditional positive regard in your life, that is not a passive person, right? If you think of someone who's a passionate teacher of a principle to you, they're not a passive person who sits back and says, okay, thought stopping, we're going to be processing and journaling. That's a bad, that's not how it should be.
So I think if we come back to the whole concept of computer-assisted therapy, like any good therapy, it should incorporate lots of different things that are good parts of therapy, all the so-called common operational principles like unconditional positive regard and empathy and understanding, kindness, and it should not be some kind of a didactic, painful kind of experience for the patients to go through. They should feel like they're being understood and helped, and that it's a good thing for them to be participating in. So that's what I've tried to do in designing these things. And by the way, I mentioned that I think that we're still at the early phase of design and development of computer-assisted therapy, and that we'll see as time goes on better programs, more sophisticated programs, ones that use more artificial intelligence to really customize things for patients. So I think there's a great potential here. Still largely untapped.
Where would you hope to see it go? And as I asked that question, I don't even know if it's 100%, well, not 100% possible, because obviously we can't tell the future, but technology seems to jump in such unpredictable ways. But you mentioned like AI, and that would be a little bit more of a involved discussion probably. Or what things would you hope that computers can add in the future as they get better?
Well, I've seen a lot of advancements just in the past few years. There are a number of apps out there that are really not therapy. They're not designed to replicate or to replace or to be an adjunct or an alternative to the standard hour of therapy, but they're still useful. And I recommend many of them to my patients. There might be an app, for example, this is a Department of Defense app called the Virtual Hope Box, which helps people record and remember things that generate a sense of hope for them. They can pull photos of family members or a pet or a favorite vacation or whatever, put it on their phone. And if they're feeling down, they can tap on that app and look at it. And it's a way of breaking through a feeling of despair or of severe anxiety. That's just a real simple thing.
That's so interesting.
Therapists recommend those to patients, and many of them are free.
Yeah,
which is. And then there's the whole area of actual programs that are designed to be a component of solid therapy. And the Good Days Ahead program and others have demonstrated that they're effective and acceptable. People use them; they save a lot of money, but we haven't seen widespread implementation. I think most therapists are still edgy about these, not sure, don't know much about them, or uneducated about them. If you were in grad school, were you taught much about computer programs for therapy? Probably not. Or in medical school or in residency or wherever you might have been trained, or nursing school, probably very little. So we need to see this coming into the mainstream of education.
Yeah.
Well, how can technology really help you as a therapist and help your patients do better? So I think that's going to happen is education, greater development of more tools that are better tools for wider varieties of problems. One thing I think we're going to see is the FDA beginning to take a look at programs that are really designed for treatment and assessing them and approving some of them, particularly if they've had solid research done on them. That's just very, very early. For a long time, the FDA was not interested in this. Yeah. But now they seem to be.
That's interesting. The FDA would be the agency that makes sense when you say it, but I never would have thought about that. Yeah,
it's a computer program, and I don't see it quite as a device. I mean, it's not like an MRI scanner or something like that. But yet, the FDA may look at this as a software, as a device-like thing that needs to be looked at. So we'll see integrity. We need to see integrity, safety, confidentiality, HIPAA compliance. All these things are very important. And I might caution readers that you need to be careful about recommending apps that there are thousands of apps out there that purport to be good for mental health. And most of them, by the way, are not designed by or have any input from psychologists, psychiatrists, anybody that knows much about mental health. They've been tech people that have thought, well, gee, I'll look at a self-help book and put a little bit of this on an app and try to make some money out of it. And are apps pulling up the information from a user and using that for their own purposes, or is this completely confidential like you would if you were seeing a therapist? If I was a patient or a therapist, I want to be sure the program I was using is one that has great integrity, solid credentials. The content of it is really good. The therapist should use it themselves, by the way. Check it out before you start recommending it.
Yeah.
As far as apps, I have Headspace and Calm and Virtual Hope Box and some of those other ones. Like I have one on My Mantra, which helps people construct a mantra. I have those on my phone. I look at them, and if I have a patient that I want to explain them to, I can just pull it up on my phone and show it to them.
Yeah.
So they're just some thoughts I have. As far as where the future goes, who knows? When I started out in this, we didn't even have CDs, let alone being able to stream high-class video.
Yeah.
And here we are. We didn't have any apps, and now we have thousands of them in mental health. So I guess we have to have a crystal ball out here. It's going to be different than it is now. And I think that since technology is so much a part of all of our lives, where we bank, almost any part of our lives, the fact that it would not be part of our work as therapists seems very strange to me. I believe that we're going to see a greater.
It really is closed-minded. I think that one of the things that I'm sure will also impact research as you go forward and say, what's the efficacy of these different programs? I'm sure it's got to be influenced by the fact that our kids and their kids and their kids, more and more, it's going to become just a more natural part of their life to say, yeah, everything's online, right? I mean, people are going to now come into the world where they'll be born, they'll go to school, they'll go to work, they'll go to therapy, they'll go to whatever they do. And the proportion of how much of it is online, think of all the people that are working from home now, but most of them, a lot of their professional career life, they are going to remember not working at home. Whereas now you're going to take a lot of people, it's going to be more common for someone to have their whole career be based off of their home office, right?
Could be, sure.
Yeah, and so as those things change, the feelings and the connection we have to technology change as well. One of the things that hit me, I chuckled a little bit when you were talking about Virtual Hope Box, because one of my first supervisors when I was an intern just in a little community mental health agency, I remember we were having a sit down, and it's funny because I liked it. I liked the idea, and I've used variations of it over the years. But my supervisor sat down and we're talking about somebody, and she said, well, sometimes I'll suggest people go and get a shoebox, and they'll every day find something to put in this shoebox, whether it's a picture or an item or a rock they found outside or a beautiful whatever flower. And then once a week they sit down and pull them out and look at it. That's what that is. It's the same thing, right?
That's exactly it.
The same thing.
Yeah. It's just a quick aside. There's been a fair amount of research now on using cognitive behavior therapy to decrease the risk of suicide. And one particularly important study was done down at the University of Pennsylvania by Greg Brown, who's an associate of mine, and his associates. And they used the Virtual Hope Box, or not a Virtual Hope Box, but a Hope Box, like you talk about, a real box, as a way of countering suicidal thoughts and behavior. And that was just part of the treatment, but they showed about a 50% decrease in subsequent suicide attempts compared to usual treatment by doing something like this. So a simple kind of suggestion to people to keep things in mind that cut through that despair and hopelessness that can breed suicidality.
Yeah. Huh.
So now we have it available with a tech thing that therapists can suggest to people.
Well, and it's funny because I've done the same thing with young people. They won't go get a shoebox, but they'll use their phone on their camera. Take a picture every day that reminds you the world's not terrible. And then, what'd you get? Well, let's scroll through them here. And so, yeah, it really is just a variation on how we do the same things. And I think that's once people embrace that, one of the best quotes I've ever heard about technology was that technology doesn't change what we do. It just changes the pace and the way in which we do it. So it has certain pros and cons and things we have to be careful of, but we don't want to underestimate the good it can do when we embrace it. And I think it's wonderful work that you're doing, and it brings our field, anything that brings it more into the homes and into the hearts and minds or whatever of people, and actually helps them to recover and go through what they need to go through to live happy and healthy lives is a wonderful thing. I think. Before we go today, I always like to ask everybody who comes on the show if they have anything that they would recommend as a favorite charity or organization that they are aware of that's out there. It could be related to mental health, but it doesn't have to be. Just everybody out there might want to be aware of anything that could help other people that they should be spending their time or money thinking about or doing. Do you have any favorite charities or nonprofits?
Well, thanks for asking, Dwight. I'd say the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention is a national organization. My own work is at the University of Louisville Depression Center, and we do a fair amount of research, and we do a lot of community outreach and education, and are trying to make a difference here in our region. So particularly if you're from our region and you'd like to help us out a little bit, we can always use the support because we really need it to expand our services and to find new treatments that help people more than the ones we have right now.
Right. Fantastic. And where can people find you if they want to follow more of your research or get involved with you and what you're doing?
I have a website that I can tell you about, and I have social media accounts. You can follow me. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Jesse Wright, MD, with a capital J for Jess. My website is jesswrightmd.com. That's my address on Instagram, jesswrightmd.com. And I have a Facebook professional page at Jesse Wright Author. And I might just mention, if you don't mind, that as I'm getting more mature in my career, I've taken up fiction writing and have a novel coming out in April. And so if you go to any of these things, you'll find out a little bit about my fiction career, which has been sort of fun for me. And I'm trying to integrate psychiatry, my experience as a therapist, with fiction writing. So this story is about someone who has severe PTSD after serving in World War II. It's a World War II era novel. Cool. And how this person, in a day when very little was known about PTSD, was able to have some resilience and get through a pretty tough time in his life. So some people might be interested in that. The name of that book is called A Stream to Follow.
A Stream to Follow?
A Stream to Follow, okay. Yes. It's a metaphorical title, but if you like fly fishing, there's a few scenes of fly fishing in there since I'm a fly fisherman.
Oh, very good. Very good. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I know we had talked a little bit about that as we were setting this up, and we may get together again to talk a little bit more about the book as it's coming out. So I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, I'd love to do it. I think that there's a interesting tale of psychologists and psychiatrists that have taken up fiction writing at some point in their career. I wonder why someone would choose to do that. If I could talk about it.
Now you know. Yeah. Now we can talk more about that. Well, and as always, too, anybody out there who would like to connect with the show or get involved, you can hit me up on Twitter at BreakABrain, or you can email me, dwighthurst@gmail.com. Let me know about things you'd like us to be talking about and any questions that you may have. And Jesse, thank you. And I'm sure, as I said, we'll be talking again soon.
Thank you, Dwight. Great to be with you.
Thank you for listening to the Court Temp Arts Podcast Network. To listen to more Court Temp Arts shows, visit courtemparts.com.